Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be re-reviewing Banjo-Tooie for the Nintendo 64. I hope you'll forgive me if the footage seems a bit like it contains too many boss battles and minigames, as I had to create two separate files just to do this review justice. The first to rebeat the game so that my feelings and thoughts could be updated. The second so that I could capture footage, but then a lot of the footage of regular gameplay got cut twice. So it's been a heck of a time getting even this much, but at least you can replay the boss battles and minigames anytime you want, so that's why there's so many of them, because you can just replay them from the menu. Now, without further ado, let's get this started. So Banjo-Tooie was the sequel to Banjo-Kazooie and came out only 2 years after the original masterpiece. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. Both Majora's Mask and Super Smash Bros. Melee came out 2 years after their original masterpieces. However, while those games had great success, Banjo-Tooie is more of a mixed bag. On one hand, this checks off every box for proper sequel design. You make it bigger and better, you improve upon things that worked in the original, you remove the problematic areas, and you introduce new mechanics that feel faithful to the original while still feeling like the series is evolving. You guys have heard that line too many times. So, in many ways, Banjo-Tooie does check off those boxes really nicely. The worlds are considerably bigger than they were in Banjo-Kazooie. You have all of the moves from the original game available right from the start, and you can skip the tutorial if you already remember them. And you also learn several new moves. The music feels a lot more grander and more atmospheric, even if it's slightly less memorable than Banjo-Kazooie's. And it just seems like the stakes are a lot higher. However, this is all really going to depend on taste, but in my personal opinion, I feel like the game went for a quantity over quality type of feel. Now, just to be clear, I don't hate Banjo-Tooie. I don't even think it's an adequate game. I still think it's a great game, just held down by a lot of over-ambition and not powerful enough hardware to really pull it off. For starters, if you're playing the original Nintendo 64 version like I am, this game chugs like crazy. Even when nothing is happening, even when you're doing something as simple as standing on a warp pad and selecting where you want to warp to in a world, the game runs at like 5 frames per second and makes Nintendo Switch Online look generous. So it makes me wonder how come this couldn't have been better optimized. Banjo-Kazooie didn't have any slowdown of the sort, and you could argue, well, Banjo-Kazooie didn't have as big of worlds and it had more of a simplistic design. However, Banjo-Tooie also has the downside of being uglier than Banjo-Kazooie, which is really weird. Like, aren't sequels supposed to improve upon the graphics foundation? Now, admittedly, this is on the same hardware, so you would expect it to not be a huge leap up, such as between Smash 64 and Melee, because you're going from an N64 to a GameCube. But if Banjo-Tooie was really going to require the Expansion Pak just to play the game, I didn't know how to test this, because my N64 has always kind of just had the Expansion Pak, then wouldn't that mean that the Expansion Pak would help the game to look better instead of it actually running worse and in turn ending up being more dark and murky? If Banjo-Kazooie is the bright and colorful Super Mario 64 wannabe, then Banjo-Tooie is the dark and ugly Majora's Mask wannabe in comparison. A lot of the levels feel like instead of legitimate platforming, you're more of just wandering around trying to search your surroundings. And while it's true that the game is littered with lots of collectibles and things to find around every corner, it feels like the corners take a lot longer to get to than they did in Banjo-Kazooie. So as a result, whereas Banjo-Kazooie has really memorable worlds and locations and music that I'm pretty sure a lot of us who've grown up playing the games can remember most of the layouts in our heads without the need of a map, it's not as easy to do that in Banjo-Tooie just because a lot of hallways and passageways end up being kind of the same. Now, the level themes are still just as creative as ever. In the first 3 levels alone, you go through a Mayan temple, then an underground mine, and then an amusement park. And the game does a great job of feeling like you're immersed in the environment that it's trying to go for. When you're at the amusement park, you really do feel like you're riding rides and getting food from the food stands and all the stuff that you used to love about going to the carnival. Let's hope those ever return. And in the mine, you really do feel like you're digging around for gold and talking with southern talking prospectors. And the music is much more immersive this time around, which some people have moaned, because Banjo-Kazooie has always been one of those happy-go-lucky type soundtracks, but I personally really love it, especially when you get to the fourth world and you get under a bit. You know what I'm talking about, but I'm just trying not to have spoilers. The boss music in particular is really spectacular, as even though it didn't use a real orchestra, this is probably the closest you're going to get to a symphonic score on the Nintendo 64, as Grant Kirkhope just really knows how to work the N64 sound chip to make it seem a lot grander than the time period should have allowed. So, a lot of times these boss battles ended up standing the test of time more than even some modern boss battles. Like Wind Waker's battle music is a joke compared to this game. However, where the problems lie is when the game tries too hard to make the game bigger and better. There are moments, for example, where Banjo and Kazooie enter first-person shooter modes, where Banjo holds Kazooie like a rifle. But these are oftentimes hard to control. Maybe I'm just bad at shooters, but I found them to be some of the worst parts of the game. Thankfully, only one section is actually required to beat the game, and that's the final battle. And the rest of the first-person segments you can completely ignore. But regardless, I am thankful that they're optional, and I do think that the controls worked well enough for the Nintendo 64. I just don't like the challenges associated with them, most of which are timed, which makes them even worse, as you know how much I don't like timers in my video games. Also, they try to make it so that all of the worlds are interconnected, because in Banjo-Kazooie, each world was a self-contained sandbox area where after you finished exploring one world, you'd go back to Gruntilda's lair, the hub world, and then you'd go to the next world after you'd found enough Jiggies to complete the puzzle. That's still the case here, but there are instances where you'll have to travel in a secret passage to get from one world or the next. After the second world, you repair a train, and you can open up train stations that allow you to literally ride the hype train into the next world. Now this is really cool most of the time, as it gives the game a sense of connectedness that I praised games like Super Mario Sunshine for having. However, more often than not, this ends up just feeling like padding. In one particularly annoying example later in the game, you encounter a dysfunctional family of dinosaurs. And you're told that you have to help the 3 dinosaur children with their problems. One of them is shrunken, so you have to get Mumbo to use his magic to make the child enlarge. The other kid is lost, and so you have to go find her. And the final kid is sick, so you have to find a doctor to help him. Now, getting the kid to grow bigger, that's the part that's not that bad. You just bring Mumbo into the cave and have him use his magic to enlarge the kid. The problem is that you can't use Mumbo's magic to help the sick child. The mother will say, "Oh, I do hope you find a witch doctor that can cure this ailment." And it's like, Mumbo's right there. Why can't you just cast a spell on both of them? Have one spell be to enlarge the kid and have the other heal. But no, what you have to do to foster this sense of connectedness is that you have to take the train all the way to the cliff top to get Mumbo to cast a spell in the hub world, and then go back and bring the child back after she's cured, of which you have to be able to have the move to carry the child. But, you can't just walk into the cave and pick up the child. Instead, you have to talk to the mother to learn that the child is sick, because seeing the child coughing just isn't enough. Why didn't they have it so that the opening cutscene when you walk into the cave is the woman saying, "Greetings, strangers. I was wondering if I could trouble you with a problem I am having." I mean, they do that in other areas of the game, so why not this one? So it just feels like that's a lot of backtracking for the sake of backtracking, and it doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense why Mumbo's abilities change between worlds. And I just feel like Banjo-Tooie doesn't have that nice flow like Banjo-Kazooie does. In that game, with only 2 Jiggies being the exceptions, you could complete every world on your first visit. The only exceptions are in Freezeezy Peak, when you need the running shoes from Gobi's Valley, and in Gobi's Valley, where you need the Beak Bomb from Freezeezy Peak. But those are 2 isolated examples among 100 Jiggies. In Banjo-Tooie, though, this happens all the time and in every single world. And it gets really annoying that, with the exception of the final world, you always have to be going back and forth and back and forth. At least you don't have the annoying note scores or the vanishing Jinjos to contend with, but sometimes you have worse problems, like the fact that the notes are required to buy the new moves from jam jars, even though the moves were free in the original game. Also, Gruntilda doesn't seem like she's as frightening of a villain because, admittedly, she does kill 2 characters within the first hour of the game, but then after that, she kind of doesn't really do anything besides occasionally narrating for the minigames at the Carnival World. Even her quiz show near the end doesn't feel as cool as it does in Banjo-Kazooie, because it feels like, okay, because Banjo-Kazooie did it, we kind of have to follow along. Now, at some points I might be just repeating what Exoparadigm Gamer said, and I don't want to come across as though I watched his video and just said, I'll Paulify it. I do want to reiterate that as much as I'm complaining about Banjo-Tooie, I still had a blast playing it. I just found that I didn't have as much of a blast as I used to in the past. I don't know, maybe it's because I had a time limit when I first played the original game, and so playing it in short bursts made it so that it didn't feel as tedious. But going back to it now, it just felt like I was anxiously awaiting the game to be over so that I could get to the review, as opposed to looking forward to every time it was like, okay, it's the next day, time for another Banjo-Tooie adventure. And I really like a lot of these worlds as exploration pieces. As you know me, I love games like Breath of the Wild. I like games where I can wander around and try to figure out what is what. However, what Breath of the Wild does differently is that it makes its locales varied, and it makes a lot of things to discover to make your journey worthwhile, such as discovering the shrines, or another beautiful set piece, or a side quest. Whereas in Banjo-Kazooie, a lot of its locations tend to blend together, like in this mine world, for example. A lot of the tunnels end up just feeling like similar shades of color, and you often get lost and confused because this game's graphics are already so ugly to begin with. Not to mention the fact that this is a dank, dark mine, so even if you have the brightness turned all the way up, you're still going to have a heck of a time navigating around. Now, to be fair, Banjo-Tooie does have the option to play the game in widescreen, which is nice because I have a widescreen 4K TV, but it doesn't have other options that Donkey Kong 64 has. You can't turn off the sound effects like you could in that game, so if you don't like the gibberish, if you're like my sister, for example, you're gonna have to put up with it. And some of it, for some odd reason, you can't skip, which is especially annoying because Banjo-Tooie has a lot more sections that are copy and paste than Banjo-Kazooie did. Maybe it's because this came out the same year as Majora's Mask and they wanted to go for the whole like repetition angle. But in that game it was justified because Link in the story was going through a time loop. If you have to go through the same animation every single time you open a world, and have to hear the same dialogue every time you give Mumbo a Globo, and every time you give Humble Wumba a Globo, it gets to be really annoying, really fast, especially when some of this dialogue you can't skip. Also, having Mumbo as a playable character sounded cool at first, and it kind of is, but it also kind of makes it so that he's a little bit lamer than he was in Banjo-Kazooie. In the original game, Mumbo appeared sporadically, and when he did, he gave you a transformation that would help you out in that particular world. So it felt like when you found Mumbo, you were in for a rare treat that would change up the gameplay experience. They try to replicate this by making it so that Mumbo no longer transforms you into different creatures, but instead you take direct control of him, and then you use his magic situationally to make something happen in each world. A lot of times these spells are actually really useful. Like in the water world, Mumbo will cast a spell so that you have unlimited air, which doesn't happen in any other world. However, the fact that these are, 1, situational, and 2, they're based on each world, it kind of lessens Mumbo's bragging rights in the first game where he says, "Me best shaman in all game." It's like, if you're the best shaman in all of game, why can't you do any of these magic spells throughout the world and maybe have unique challenges that make Mumbo's abilities more spread out instead of that annoying dinosaur cave example that I gave where you have to find Mumbo in another world just to use his abilities. Or maybe implement a power system, like you did in Banjo-Kazooie, where if Banjo and Kazooie went too far outside the world, Mumbo would say his magic is too weak, and therefore Banjo and Kazooie would have to change back. That could be a good way to mitigate the fact that Mumbo has different abilities in each world. He's taken over by Humba Wumba, who's a Native American designed woman who also speaks kind of broken English, and her transformations a lot of times are significantly better than Mumbo's in the previous game. Some of the old transformations from the original game return. Even the jokes that Mumbo made at random are now fully fleshed out transformations, like the washing machine and T-Rex. And all of the returning transformations have new abilities, such as when you turn into a bumblebee, now you can shoot stingers, which makes it so that you have some aerial challenges. And a lot of times these work really well. I don't like all of the transformations. Playing as a washing machine was so annoying that I didn't even bother doing it again for this playthrough, but more often than not, they got the job done. So, my feelings on Banjo-Tooie are mixed, to say the least. It sounds like I hate the game with the way that I'm tearing apart every bit of it. And I don't mean to sound like I'm telling you guys that you shouldn't get it, or that it's a bad game. It's still the second best Banjo game, and I would still say that it's a worthy platformer, but I would say it's not as much of a platformer as what you're probably used to. It's more of like what Breath of the Wild would be if it were a collectathon and it had the British type humor that frequently breaks the fourth wall in even more amusing ways than the last game. But on the other hand, it also chugs like crazy on the original hardware, which makes it so that those of us who are Nintendo fans don't really have an argument in favor of Banjo should have stayed on the N64. It kind of makes us look weak now. And the fact that a lot of the game just feels like filler and padding, as some challenges will often repeat themselves, there's repeated dialogue, there's a lot of slowdown, and it just doesn't have that cohesion and memorability that the original game had. Some people are going to like this better just because they like the fact that it's much more grand and majestic, and Banjo-Kazooie was very much a my first platformer, and this game is significantly harder, as I still haven't 100%ed it, but Banjo-Kazooie I've 100%ed at least 3 times. So, players who are looking for more of a challenge and more of a big world to explore might get a lot out of Banjo-Tooie, and you're still going to get way more mileage out of this than any of the Banjo games that came after it. And this will also give you a good appreciation for the content in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, as even though there was more from Banjo-Kazooie, the stuff that did make its way in from Banjo-Tooie really worked its wonders, and I think you guys will especially love seeing the context for the names of some of the boss battle tunes that got in. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Please let me know if you have any comments, concerns, critiques, or criticisms, and if I left anything out. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and let's hope for a proper Banjo 3. Bye!